These days, there's only one big bad dragon in town, and that's Vhagar. The Mount of Prince Aemon Targaryen is by far the largest and most dangerous dragon in the Seven Kingdoms, no matter what the Caraxes gang tells you. But it wasn't always that way. For the first half-century of Targaryen rule, Vhagar was number 2, right behind the infamous Black Dread. Even today, she gets compared to Balerion because he's the standard bearer for Targaryen dragons. The oldest and largest dragon left to memory, he saw Valyria in its glory and doom, and has taken down a dragon or a few in its time. Just like Vhagar. That got us thinking, what if these two titans went at it with each other? Who would win in a battle between Balerion and Vhagar? Well, that's what we're here to find out. So, spoiler warning, because a few things we discussed today might ruin House of the Dragon for you. But before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. The biggest and baddest bastard in black. Balerion's peak fighting size and condition. In a world where magic flourished and the 14 flames burned bright, we're sure dragons grew much larger than Balerion. If they survived the constant infighting of the Valyrian families, that is. When Daenerys Targaryen makes her way through the Red Waste and reaches Vice Telorio in a clash of kings, her blood riders find a massive dragon skeleton. Ricardo is able to ride through the skull's gullet on his horse, and this dragon must have died centuries before the Targaryens ruled Westeros. It's said that the remains of dragons can be found all over the world, from Ib to Sothorius, from Asshai to the Red Lake. House Targaryen became the sole owners of dragons when the doom befell Valyria, and no Targaryen is ever said to have flown as far as the Red Waste after relocating to Dragonstone. The dragon skeleton from that region predates the Doom, therefore, and its sheer size might be misleading in that there could have been dragons much larger than it in antiquity. The only dragons that reached its size after the Doom were the dragons of the Conquest, with Balerion being the only one that exceeded it. Born amidst the fires of the Freehold, the Black Dread was the last dragon that saw Valyria in its glory, and perhaps that's why its prime was sustained for far longer than any others. Balerion was over 114 years old when Aegon began his conquest, but there are no reports of the dragon feeling aged or sluggish. In fact, all reports of Balerion make him out to be one of the most deadly and efficient dragons of all time. The dive bomb move he executed at Harrenhal is a great example of this. We've seen from the show that as dragons age, taking off and maintaining flight becomes harder for them. Vhagar can't make sharp turns or dangerous dives because it takes all her might to pull up her weight on a descent. She makes low passes and ensures that when she does dive, it's at a worthy target. She wouldn't be able to rise high up into the air until her visage was no more than a speck on the moon, and then dive bomb Harrenhal so quickly that no one has time to react. If she tries that, she'll crash into the castle, and then there would be another kind of tragedy we'd be speaking of. But Balerion rather nimbly pulls up last minute and roasts everyone within the castle with his flames, which means he isn't quite out of his peak fighting shape just yet. His size during the conquest is the same as Vhagar's from the show, minus the jowls and the weathering that's evident on her scales. Balerion would have felt more like Vermithor, except he'd be much larger, darker, and durable, with that last bit being the key here. Dragons become harder to kill as they grow older. Their scales become so tough that they're impervious to fire and even dragon flame, which makes exposing the flesh beneath crucial and nigh impossible. It can be done with crossbow bolts, scorpions, and grappling hooks even, but out of those three things, a scorpion was the best chance of winning. That margin too is rather slim, so really at his peak, Balerion was an unstoppable behemoth of a black beast with near impervious skin. The only vulnerable parts of his body would have been his eyes and his wing membranes, but with wings large enough to cover villages and towns with their shadows, a few holes could hardly keep the Black Dread down. In A Game of Thrones, there are descriptions of the skulls of the Conquest dragons, and Balerion's is the largest, big enough to swallow an aurochs or a mammoth whole, and then the other two are smaller but no less threatening in size, although a slight confusion does exist. In Tyrion Lannister's memories, Meraxes' skull was larger than Vhagar's, and this is probably because she was born before her. But as the story grew, Martin decided to make Vhagar as large as Balerion during the Conquest, and Meraxes had been dead for over a century by the dance. So either Tyrion is misremembering things, or Martin simply retconned the skull sizes. But regardless, Balerion's skull being the largest is always going to be consistent across all media of Ice and Fire. His first 50 years of active service saw him decimate several armies and strongholds all over Westeros, including the infamous burning of Harrenhal. No other Targaryen dragon has been able to recreate such an event, even at a smaller scale or magnitude. They've burned castles, to be sure. Balerion himself burned every seat in Dorne at least twice over and fused the red sands into glass with his flames during the First Dornish War. He would burn at least a dozen keeps in the Westerlands during Maegor the Cruel's war against the Faith, and he also became the first kinslayer among dragons when he took the life of Quicksilver during the battle beneath the God's Eye. But never once did the Black Dread show issues in accomplishing these feats. The first 3 Targaryen kings were able to keep a hold of the Iron Throne thanks to the Black Dread, and at his peak, one could only hope to slay him with an ambush of epic proportions. Conventional methods would likely fail, but that isn't necessarily true for Vhagar, the only dragon that has more kills than the Black Dread. Vhagar fighting size and power over the years. Vhagar was either the first or the second dragon to be born on Dragonstone. We're a little unclear on whether Meraxes was born before or after her, because both of them were full-grown dragons at the start of the conquest, but only one of them got the chance to grow further. Vhagar was born 52 years before Aegon's conquest, and by the time it began, she would have been the size of Caraxes or Melis at the very least. It's said that the Targaryen dragons that were raised in the Dragon Pit generation never reached the size of their ancestors because of the lack of freedom, but there could be another explanation for that. Magic in George R.R. Martin's world is deeply tied to the very foundations of the earth. The magic of the old gods comes from the weirwood trees, and the magic of the Valyrians was intrinsically tied into their volcanoes. The 14 flames were crucial to their blood magic rituals, and when they imploded, so did most of Valyrian magic. The only reason the Targaryens were able to sustain the dragons they brought with them was because Dragonstone had a volcano, the Dragonmont, and so they could effectively make it the new 14 flames. However, as you can tell, one volcano isn't 14, and so the power that facilitates the growth of dragons must have surely diminished. 50-year-old Vhagar must have been smaller than 50-year-old Balerion, but she was still larger than most pit dragons, and that's what matters over here. Vhagar's first active stint as a Targaryen warmount saw her deal with the most damage across the Seven Kingdoms. She was the first flame of the conquest, setting the roofs of Stokeworth ablaze. She burned an entire fleet to ashes, burned 2 armies on the field of fire, brought a kingdom into Aegon's fold by giving its king a joyride, and then accompanied Balerion in turning the Dornish sands a shade redder. During the Faith Militant Uprising, she burnt more seats than Balerion in the Riverlands, and their combined threat was enough to dissuade outright rebellion during Maegor's reign. Vhagar entered a hiatus period after Visenya's death and was followed by Balerion, but unlike the Black Dread, she could still fight, and she did. Vhagar re-entered action when she was claimed by Prince Balon the Brave, the father of Viserys and Daemon. At this time, she must have gone well past Vermithor's size as depicted in House of the Dragon, and fought in more battles than him. With Balon, Vhagar participated in the Fourth Dornish Wars as well as the Moorish bloodbath, burning fleets and thousands of men on both occasions. Vhagar's martial days went into a second hiatus during her time with Laena, and by the time Aemond claimed her, she was pretty old. She became a veteran of 100 battles, and her scars make that much evident, with her wings riddled with scorpion holes, but she's held on to fighting shape longer than anyone expected her to. During the dance, she was entering the 18th decade of life, and she was still in fighting shape. In fact, she outmatched Balerion in certain aspects during that war. But all this is to say that if the Black Dread were to ever have a competitor worthy of its attention, it would be Vhagar, the last dragon born before the Targaryens became kings. Now that we've established both of their credentials, let's take a look at a battle between the two at varying stages of their lives. Prime Balerion versus Prime Vhagar. It's difficult to gauge a dragon's prime because, like reptiles, dragons experience indeterminate growth. They keep increasing in size and strength until they die, provided they have the resources and space to do so. However, Balerion and Vhagar peaked militarily at different time periods, which can give us a general idea of who would have won during their prime. Let's assume Balerion's peak was during Aegon's conquest, and Vhagar's was during the Fourth Dornish War. The difference in their age alone would give the Black Dread a massive defensive edge. Because fire cannot kill a dragon, they fight using other tools at their disposal. Their claws, teeth, and wingtips become their primary tools, and fire is more of an accessory. Now granted, if the age difference between Balerion and Vhagar was too massive, the former's breath would have played a huge role in their battle. In the show, we see Vhagar set Sunfire's flesh and scales ablaze with its flames. When the golden dragon crashes, it sports burn wounds similar to its riders. This makes a lot of sense considering dragon scales are fairly soft and permeable in their young age, and dragon flame only gets hotter with age. Even a 20-year-old dragon is far more susceptible to flame damage than someone like, say, Meleys, who was able to withstand Vhagar's flames a lot better. Tyrion Lannister might have been off mark when it came to her skull size, but what he might have been spot on about was the strength of her flames. He thought to himself that Vhagar's fire could cook a man inside his armor, and the Battle of Rook's Rest showed us that it can do way more than that. The Ash Soldier that Cole tries to command to battle is evidence that Vhagar's flames have gone beyond the steel melting point, and this must be the peak of her fire strength as well. Many dragon riders have threatened to make a second Harrenhal of many a castle in Westeros, but none have succeeded, though it wasn't for the lack of trying. It's simply possible that their fires never reached the level of Balerion's flames, so Prime Black Dread has Prime Vhagar beat in that department. He also has her beat in every other department, because naturally, being a larger dragon, Balerion's appendages give him more of an advantage. He can tear into Vhagar's scales and bite her neck off if needed, simply by the virtue of his age. Quicksilver was far older and larger than Arax at the time he took on the Black Dread, but Balerion chomped him down to size in a manner rather similar to how Vhagar beats Luke. As you might have noticed during the battle with Meleys, Vhagar was able to take a lot of damage and walk it off as though they were mere scratches. She fell down to earth locked in a dragon death spiral and simply shook it off, taking flight again after crushing some soldiers to death. Now imagine that, except Balerion takes lesser damage and finishes the fight without hiding behind a cliff. If his stone-melting breath isn't enough to blind Vhagar, his size, durability, and every other quantifiable aspect of his known anatomy would make Balerion the clear victor if he and Vhagar fought in their respective primes. The only thing that could make a difference would be their compatibility with their riders, and how well the latter can control the former. The TV show hasn't focused on this aspect of dragon riding, probably because it involves a degree of animal cruelty, but commands in High Valyrian and the fabled dragon bond weren't the only factors involved in the relationship between humans and dragons. The Valyrians used whips and chains and horns to control their prized beasts, with Dany herself taming Drogon thanks to a whip. This aspect has been cut out of the show, because it's the same concept as whipping horses for more speed, and no one really wants to see that these days, do they? But taut leather aside, experience is another factor to consider. Balerion was claimed by 4 people that we know of, not counting Daenys the Dreamer, and 3 of them were king. 2 of them were extremely capable military leaders and dragon riders that were intimate with the ways of their creatures. The only battle-tested and culturally aware rider Vhagar had was Visenya. Balon was too young when he claimed her, Laena was too young when she claimed her, and Aemond, well, the more we focus on his actual experience as opposed to his training, the better it would be. With a Visenya riding her into battle, Vhagar would still have some chance against Balerion. Their size difference, as significant as it would be, could also be nullified by Vhagar's relative youth and agility. We saw that Meleys had her on the ropes for a bit with her speed, and had Rhaenys been a more skilled warrior, she could have probably anticipated Aemon's ambush. Visenya would make no such mistake, though we have to say, after her, the One-Eyed Prince is the best bet to make any good on the promise of Vhagar besting Balerion. Give the Black Dread any man capable of handling him in his prime, and he would turn any dragon into dinner. The same can't be said for a dragon that matches it in size, though. Prime Balerion versus House of the Dragon Vhagar, a battle of near equals. So often, people get confused thinking that the Vhagar they're seeing in House of the Dragon is how big Balerion was overall. But here's the thing, she had only approached his size at the time of the conquest. Balerion entered a state of semi-retirement after Maegor's death, which became permanent once he returned from his 2-year joyride with Aerea Targaryen. But he only truly stopped growing the year before his death, which means that he was definitely larger than he was at the time of the conquest, even if it was only by a few inches, or meters. You can never tell with dragons. Still, Vhagar reaching his size actually gives her a leg up, because technically she's older than Balerion in his prime, and that works just fine for her. Like we mentioned, dragon scales only get harder with age, and their flames only get hotter. Balerion at his prime was an old dragon, but he wasn't as old as Vhagar during the dance, who was nearing 2 centuries. Consequently, his scales should be softer than Vhagar's, however marginal that might be. It won't have any real consequence in the grand scheme of things. Both of them will be shaking chest rakes off like flea bites, and their jaws will become the primary players at that point. Even their fires should be more or less evenly matched, though we're not sure if Vhagar has reached stone melting levels yet. She's certainly pretty close to it, considering once she lets her flames loose, she can leave dragons with 3rd-degree burns. But whether she can melt the towers of a stout keep like Harrenhal, we're not sure. Still, the size similarity should even out the playing field, which would leave only one sphere of competition: mobility. One of the downsides of growing forever is that there is such a thing as too much growth. If you guys noticed in House of the Dragon, Vhagar doesn't take off vertically like younger dragons do. Even Caraxes hits closer to 90 degrees on his takeoff despite his unusual build. Vhagar always takes a run-up before ascending like a modern airplane, because that's her size working against her. After serving Maegor in his wars against the Faith, Balerion became difficult to rouse and moody, like a grandpa that just wants to be left alone with his whiskey to brood. His joyride with Aria is the last time he flies around actively, and for the next 40 years, he enjoys the hospitality of the Dragon Pit. Towards the end of his life, he can't even lift himself off the ground long enough to reach Dragonstone, and Vhagar clearly isn't there yet. But if she brings her landing gear issues to a fight with a prime Balerion, she's going to have a tough time hanging in there. Prime Balerion would certainly face issues taking off vertically on account of his massive size, but his prime would come 90 years before his demise. We mentioned how nimble he'd have to be to pull off his sneak attack on Harrenhal. If he brings that kind of pace to a fight with old Vhagar, Balerion is sure to win out. Besides, his fires melt stones. Even if he can't give Vhagar the sunfire treatment, he can blind her with ease by spewing fire at her eyes. With the size advantage neutralized, mobility will be the key to winning this fight, and in that department, we're going to put our money on Balerion. That's 2 for the Black Dread and 1 for Vhagar. So now, let's discuss the final scenario where these two might have found themselves locked in a battle. Old Balerion versus House of the Dragon Vhagar. If Balerion could have maintained his shape from the Earth Militant Wars into his later life, we wouldn't be having this discussion. But something happened that made him pretty much the dragon equivalent of an invalid. When Balerion disappeared with Aria, her mother Rhaena spent the better part of 2 years flying all over Westeros looking for her. She found no trace of her daughter or the Black Dread. And then one day in 56 AC, both returned to King's Landing in conditions worse than anyone could have imagined. If Aria had flown Balerion to any city, she would have been fine. She was bonded to the largest and most dangerous dragon in the world, even if he got a little turkey-tired these days. No one in their right mind would try to challenge Aria and Balerion. No man, at least. If she headed towards the jungles of Sithorios, she would have faced issues, but she probably would have been fine. A Valyrian dragon rider named Genera Baleris once flew over the continent for 3 years looking for its other half. She never found it, but the fact that she returned to tell the tale means that she managed to survive. And as mischievous as Aria Targaryen was, she was also a survivor. She might have survived the diseases and the wyverns and the brindled men of that strange continent. But Balerion seems to have taken her to the one place where no one in their right mind wants to go: Valyria. Septon Barth speculates that with his rider being a child, Balerion picked their destination. And since he was the last creature in the world to still remember the freehold, he took her to Valyria. Scholars and maesters tend to reject his words, but most of what Barth says turns out to be true, so we can agree with this assessment, especially because of what it did to Aria and Balerion. The princess died hours after the return from fiery parasitic chimeras that sound a lot like the fireworms of Valyria. No evidence of this was kept besides Barth's writings, so we can't know for certain, but this is the leading explanation. If Aria picked up fireworms from Valyria, then Balerion had to have gotten in trouble as well, and he did. The Black Dread had fought in hundreds of battles, faced death and worse, and never was he fatally wounded. he never needed prolonged periods of rest and recuperation, because Balerion was the dominant force in the world. So it's scary to think what could have left him with half-healed wounds, old scars that weren't from the conquest, and a massive 9-foot-long jagged rent in his side. This wound never closed up or healed properly, and Balerion became sickly soon after. In his youth, Prince Balon smacked the Black Dread on his snout on one occasion, and the fact that he wasn't dead because of it tells you just how far Balerion must have been. Aemond just tried to play keepsies and dragonfire, and she chased him out of her lair with fire and fury. At the time of his death, Balerion would have been larger than Vhagar, yes, but he also would have been dying from disease, and the fact that he could barely circle King's Landing 3 times the year of his death is further proof of his weakness. Old Balerion would have been easily washed by Vhagar, especially if it was encumbered by the effects of that wound. But even if he wasn't, growth indeterminism would get to some point and make him so large that he'd be practically immobile. All Vhagar has to do is swoop in and finish off the old dragon, and honestly, after his alarming return to court, it'd be a mercy killing. Even House of the Dragon Vhagar has more mobility than old Balerion, and she's getting up there. So while it would be dishonorable to make them fight in that condition, if they did, Vhagar would curb stomp Balerion like she did Melis, minus the chokeout, because the Black Dread's neck would probably be thicker than her own. Marvelous verdict. As long as Balerion is active and in fighting shape, there is no dragon that can stand up to him, not even Vhagar. Sure, if they fight at equal size, it will be more of a battle, but by the end of the series, you will learn that size isn't all that matters, especially when it comes to dragons. But now that we've gotten to our opinions on Balerion versus Vhagar, we'd love to hear yours. Let us know in the comments down below, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, don't forget, history is written in fire and blood. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks, everyone.